Hello everyone, my name is Emma Hofen. I'm doing my presentation about protests in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a Chinese island that's technically controlled by the Chinese, but is semi-independent and wants democracy. So how did that happen, and what's happening right now? At this exact second, there are Hong Kong students at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University who are occupying the school in protest of some things that the Chinese have been doing. Some have left the school, and they were subjected to police violence when they left. And so that's a tense situation that's happening this very second as I am recording this presentation. So Hong Kong is a British island. It was under the control of China until the Opium Wars, and when it became a British colony. It was a British colony until 1997, when sovereignty of the island was returned to the People's Republic of China, but they have an interesting relationship because Hong Kong has a lot of freedom while China is communist and very totalitarian, and they operate under the one country, two systems doctrine, and so Hong Kong has many freedoms that its mainland people, that Chinese mainland people don't have. These current protests started with an extradition bill. An extradition bill, basically what it means is that if you were arrested in Hong Kong, you could be taken to China for your trial and for your punishment. So what that means for Hong Kongers is that instead of being tried in Hong Kong, where you would probably get a fair trial and a fair punishment, you would be sent to China, where you would have a secret trial, and the Chinese government could basically do anything to you. That's how it started. Since the protests have gone on, there have been more demands that have been made. The 5 demands that they claim that the protesters have stated are that the extradition bill be withdrawn, which it has been since September. The other demand is that the protest be called protest and not characterized as riots, what the Chinese government is tried very hard to do, is call them riots. The third is that arrested protesters will receive amnesty. The fourth is that an independent inquiry into the police brutality will be made, since there have been a lot of police brutality, and most of that goes unnoticed when it happens in China. So the Hong Kongers want to hold the Chinese accountable for that. And the fifth demand is complete universal suffrage, meaning everyone in Hong Kong gets a vote. That's what they've been asking for long before this protest. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So Hong Kong, as I said, was British colony. Then it was under the control of Japan for a little bit during World War II, but that the British took back control of it. In the 50s and 60s, it grew economically. There were protests to get better working conditions for the lower class, and then that happened in the 60s. And then in the 70s, by the 70s I should say, the Hong Kong island was considered a global economic powerhouse, especially in Asia. In 1997, the handover happened. The control of Hong Kong was given from Britain to China, and the two-system doctrine was adopted for the next 50 years at least. So capitalism and democracy would remain in Hong Kong for at least 50 years after the handover. So Hong Kongers are enjoying those benefits. Meanwhile, in China, human rights violations occur frequently. It's widely known across the globe that this is true. They will harass protesters and dissidents. They persecute religious groups. They discriminate against minorities. They torture their citizens when they're arrested. They censor heavily the internet and media. They have strict control over family planning, forcing many women and families to get abortions. They have little to no property rights, and they routinely kill and put in asylums mentally ill people. So Hong Kong has protested a lot. This is not a new thing. After the handover, there have been several protests. Starting in 2003, they protested a national security reform bill. In 2012, China wanted to change the education system, and many families and parents saw that as China wanting to brainwash their children, and so they protested that. In 2014, there was a famous umbrella revolution where people brought umbrellas out, and that's, again, they wanted universal suffrage. They wanted everyone to have a vote. In 2016, the fishbowl riots were the start of the protest that year. Chinese cracked down on street vendors, and the Hong Kongers came out in support of the street vendors. And later that year, there was a rally that called for total independence of Hong Kong from China. They also hold vigils every year for a massacre that happened in Tiananmen when protesters were in Tiananmen, and they were massacred by the Chinese government. It's illegal to talk about that in China, and so they hold vigils for that every year. These protests here in 2019 started in February with the extradition bill. By the end of March, there were thousands on the streets to protest the bill. By the end of April, there were tens of thousands. Lawmakers had some scuffles in May, and amendments were made to the bill, but they actually made the bill worse, not better. By June, there were lawyers on the street. Lawyers don't often get involved in Hong Kong in protests, but they did on this occasion. And by June 9th, there were more than 500,000 protesters, which is an insane amount when you consider the population of Hong Kong. That's well over half of the population of the island. I believe that would be around 70%, if not more, of the population of the island was out to protest this stuff. Violence began a few days later. Police fired rubber bullets and tear gas. Government offices were shut down. This was the city's largest and most violent protest as of yet. The Hong Kong Prime Minister, in response to that, declared the extradition bill delayed. Protesters charged the Legislative Council on the anniversary of the British handover, and it just continues like that. They take over the airport, they take over train stations, the extradition bill is withdrawn, they trap their Prime Minister, their Prime Minister is trying to resign because it's so bad, and then violence just continues into the fall and gets worse and worse and worse. Other countries have responded by saying they support Hong Kong but not doing much to show it because they don't want to anger China. And so that's kind of where we're at right now with these things. Thank you for watching and listening.